In this video lecture, we're going to discuss comma rules for technical writers, and in particular, how to fake it till you make it. First thing we're going to talk about is comma rules that are related to independent and dependent clauses. We need to define what these things are first before we move on. An independent clause is essentially a complete sentence that can stand by itself. A dependent clause is something that is not a complete sentence. It needs the help of an independent clause to become a complete sentence. You may recognize them as sentence fragments or something similar to that. Here's the comma rule for independent clauses. Only use a comma between two independent clauses with the help of a coordinating conjunction. If you don't remember what a coordinating conjunction is, here's an easy way to remember. The acronym FANBOYS. In English, the coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. This is the complete list. So let's use one of these and figure out if a sentence is correct. Here's a sample. We reorganized the study group, comma, we redistributed the work more evenly. Take a look at this. We've got two independent clauses going on. First, we reorganized the study group. It's a complete sentence. Second, good Lord, this is harder to say than one would expect. We redistributed the work more evenly. That's a complete sentence. Therefore, this comma that goes between them is what we call a comma splice. You want to avoid these things. You can't use the comma this way. What can we do instead? We can do this. We reorganized the study group, comma, and we redistributed the work more evenly. So we've got two independent clauses, comma, coordinating conjunction. The next thing we'll talk about, the comma rule, involves restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. Let's define these things. A restrictive clause is something that is stuck into a sentence that if you remove that clause, it'll change the sentence's meaning. A non-restrictive clause is something that is stuck into a sentence. If you remove it, then you might change the amount of information in the sentence, but it does not change actual meaning of the sentence. Let's look at some examples. Here's a comma rule to go with these. Use commas around non-restrictive clauses. For example, our new factory, comma, which began operations last month, comma, is scheduled to increase production by 45%. Okay, is this correct? Let's take a look. The clause here, which began operations last month. If we take this thing out, will it fundamentally change the meaning of the sentence? No, it won't. It's information about the factory, but it doesn't change the actual meaning of the sentence. It's just the new factory is scheduled to increase production. That's at the core of it. That's what's really important. Therefore, these two commas around which began operations last month is correct. How about this one? The Hubble telescope, intended to answer fundamental questions about the origin of the universe, is located in space. Intended to answer fundamental questions about the origin of the universe is a non-restrictive clause. It is important information about the Hubble telescope, but if you remove it, does it change the meaning of the sentence? No, it does not. The big sentence idea is that the Hubble telescope is located in space. Everything else is just gravy. Therefore, these commas around it are correct. Then, another rule with restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. Don't use commas around restrictive clauses. For example, please disregard the notice you recently received from us. So please disregard the notice is an independent clause. Then you recently received from us. That is a dependent clause. But is it a restrictive clause or a non-restrictive clause? In this case, it is a restrictive clause because it defines which notice you're talking about. Therefore, we are not going to use this particular comma. Here's another example. The airplanes that were flown in the Gulf War were extremely sophisticated. that were flown in the Gulf War. Is this restrictive or non-restrictive? In this case, this is a restrictive clause. Why? It defines which airplanes you're talking about. Therefore, we are not going to use either of these commas. One thing you may be wondering is, how can I tell very easily if a sentence has a restrictive or non-restrictive clause? One thing to watch out for, and this is actually a thing that you may need to edit as well when you're talking about your writing. A non-restrictive clause often starts with which, or perhaps I should say, which is usually the right word to start a non-restrictive clause, whereas that is usually associated with a restrictive clause. So that's something to remember. If you see the word which, it might be non-restrictive, but you have to make sure that it actually is used correctly. And if you see the word that, it may be restrictive, but again, you have to make sure that the word is used correctly. Here's a comma rule. Use commas to separate items in a list. The Oxford comma is necessary for sentence clarity. So if you aren't familiar with the Oxford comma is, it is the sentence or the comma that precedes the final item in a list. For example, here's something that uses the Oxford comma. We defeated the giants, Bellatrix, and Voldemort. Notice we've got 3 commas here: giants, comma, Bellatrix, comma, and Voldemort. It's very clear that there are 3 things that we defeated. We can use that same sentence, but take out that last Oxford comma. We defeated the giants, Bellatrix and Voldemort. In this case, there's some ambiguity here. Did we defeat the giants and Bellatrix and Voldemort, or did we defeat 2 giants named Bellatrix and Voldemort? It's unclear here. Point is, without that last comma, it is still grammatically correct, but the missing comma changes the sentence's meaning. We very, very strongly recommend that you use that Oxford comma. And finally, what do you do if you don't know what you're doing? So you've come across a sentence, is this thing correct? Well, you've got 2 possibilities. Number 1, you can consult the style guide. Some of the very common ones you'll encounter are, for example, the APA manual, or this particular doorstop. This thing is huge. It's the Chicago Manual of Style. It's really useful. Point being, you can probably look up the answer somewhere. But at the same time, you could spend a lot of time doing that, and you may not entirely be sure if you got it right. And does your organization you're working for use APA, or do they use MLA? Do they use CSE? Do they use Chicago? Do they use Turabian? What do they use? If you aren't entirely sure and you don't have access very quickly to a style guide, one thing that you can do is totally fake it. Figure out what it is you do know. What rules are you sure you have down? And then follow those instead. So if you aren't sure if a sentence is grammatically correct, assume it's not. Then rewrite it in a way that you absolutely know is correct. That's the end of this short PowerPoint. Hope it's useful. If you have questions, please, as always, contact me, JARNET11@kennesaw.edu. Thanks very much.